Welcome to Swimming in the Gospel According to John. In this session, we take a deep dive into the story of Jesus before Pilate, John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40. Please join us. What we noticed was that there are two major words for love in the Gospel according to John. One is agapao, which is the verb, or agape, which is the noun, or phileo, or a number of words, philoi, for the noun, both of which are translated very often in the NRSV and other translations as love. So we really don't know if there's a difference between them, and there is some distinction. Not as great as some years ago, a scholar stressed when he did a major work on this and stressed the centrality of agape, which is indeed at the center. But then many people also contrasted it to this other word, phileo, and they sort of thought of that as a kind of lesser love. Agape is indeed very clearly the unmerited love that God pours out upon us and that God seeks for us to share with others. But phileo also has some of those characteristics as well. God is described as loving us with the word phileo as well. So, and speaks of his friends. So the interesting verses that put this together are in chapter 15, verses 12 through 17. And I'm going to read them without, if you have the paper piece in front of you, or if you have the email in front of you, that's fine. Well, maybe I will mention the where the specific word occurs. Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love, agapao, one another, as I have loved, agapao, you. No one has greater love, agapein, than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends, philoi. You are my friends, philoi, if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because a servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, philoi, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. So you did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I am giving you these commands so that you love, agapao, one another." Interesting sort of similarities and yet distinctions, isn't it? What's your feeling about that? What thoughts occur to you around that?
It almost feels like it makes that passage into a bit of a word play, where you have two words that have a similar translation in terms of how we read them in English, but yet they're very different things, and the way they function together in this passage makes it really almost kind of playful, I think, in a way to express something that's really deep and meaningful. But it's I don't know if it is a true word play, because I don't think the Greek words are close enough, but it's almost like English translation wordplay, maybe, or something. I don't know. That's really interesting to see that interplay the way that you just read it.
Well, and the interesting thing, of course, Jesus says, I made you friends. You're not slaves anymore. I think the word servant probably should have been really translated slave, but servant is adequate as well. You are friends to me. And elsewhere that word is used where of Jesus toward Lazarus, that he's very friendly toward Lazarus. Or the disciple whom Jesus loved, the word is with befriended. He's made a friend. And for me, this is interesting because sometimes people, Christians, I think, thought you shouldn't have special friends. But Jesus did. and it was a loving word that is used there for friendship. We will encounter this, as I noted in the email to you. We'll encounter this again as we stand at the seashore next week. I won't go into that in detail, but those two words come in play there where Jesus is having a conversation with Peter. So it's God's love is so rich that one word can't contain it. Right? Any other reflections you might have on that? What do you think about friendships? Good thing to have people that you may consider closer to you than other people? Is that unchristian? Yes, I mean, unmute.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, there are some friendships that are so deep and so lasting, and you can be apart for years and you reconnect immediately when you're back together again. And I've had the privilege and honor to have 3 of those friendships, those deep, abiding. Would that be filial friendships or?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Yeah, and I don't see anything wrong with them. I think they have enriched my life immensely.
Well, and what you're saying makes me think of how friendly Jesus is also with us, and maybe that kind of intimacy as well. So we go back and have a conversation with Jesus again, and it's we pick it up as if nothing had happened. You know each other that well. So maybe that's also what's being expressed here. Any other reflections? Yes.
I think friendships are very important, especially during this time and in the past year, because I've run into people who have told me they don't have any friends, and it would be tough because I don't know what I do about my friends. I mean, I think that's part of life. I can't imagine anybody finding anything wrong with having friends. Looking up on it, maybe at one time in the various times during Jesus' time, there was a different outlook on it. But friendship is God of this, as far as I'm concerned. I think that it's part of our being, and I'm very thankful for the friendships that I have.
Gifts, aren't they? Gifts from God to have that kind of friendship.
I think it's C.S. Lewis's 4 Loves, the book. Burton?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think of agape and filio and eros and the different kinds of love. I think when we think of Christ, we think of God's unconditional love and our call to love our enemies and love the strangers. And filio is this friendship about which Marilyn and Dennis just spoke. And they're not against each other. I think all of the kind of part of agape and eros, the special relationship one has in a marriage, for example. So I don't think them as opposed to one another. And somehow, if we didn't have agape of God's unconditional love, then when a friendship might get bumpy, we might just say, forget it. So the agape surrounds us and carries us through those rough times, let's say in a marriage too, or in a friendship. I have a friendship from kindergarten I just received a card from today. She said, "Your ever-loving friend," and that's many years ago.
She didn't even know you were having this class.
No. But I think of all these different kinds of love are wrapped in the agape love of God's unconditional love, which sustains us when those others might be both good and sometimes difficult.
Well, and the other element of this text, I think, that is significant is that Jesus calls upon the disciples to love the way they've been loved. Now, we haven't done much with the epistles of John. I partly think that they're much later. I think that they stand in the tradition, and I want to get a debate about authorship, but I have a hunch at least the very first letter of John was by him. We love because he first loved us. King James Version said, we love him because he first loved us. It says we love agapao because Christ first loved us. And as Norman points out, that is what makes it possible for us to have that godlike, in the best sense of the term, love, giving and forgiving. I need to comment, and I'm thankful now that in many instances we don't need to wear masks, but it seems to me that the call to wear a mask was an agape kind of call. To love others as God loved us, and to care enough about others that we didn't want to communicate to them an illness that we might have. And I'm sort of sad that in many Christian churches, they didn't seem to somehow see that calling. But there's a sacrificial love. Later, of course, in the culmination, where Jesus appears to the disciples in the resurrection, he says, as the Father sent me, so send I you. So we are sent to love and bear witnesses as God has. Any other thoughts on this before we move to the appearance before Pilate and Jesus' relationship to Pilate?
I just think that this Jesus' use of that word friends is a really startling and just it's a really shocking thing for Jesus the Christ to say that. You know, I think when you think about all that we believe Jesus to be in terms of theology and who Jesus is as God and human, it's amazing that Jesus would say to the disciples and to us, you are my friends. It's almost ridiculous how gracious and generous a thing that is to say, and probably in a really great illustration of exactly the kind of thing you're talking about when you talk about agape love. Whenever I read this passage, I always think of that. What an incredible thing for Jesus to have said. You are my friends.
Well, and especially, in John, who was holding before these struggling disciples who are losing their homes and are refugees and feel they haven't got a place and may well feel unloved by God because look what's happened to them, the destruction of the temple and in the laying waste of Jerusalem and in their expulsion. But for him to present this great image of a powerful Christ, but then also a very tender, intimate Christ. The relationship that their disciples are called to with Jesus is always personal, but it's never private. It's never individualistic. But it is a personal relationship. I think some of us have shied away from speaking about it that way because of the extremes, which have, in a sense, accented only a personal relationship. I remember a priest way back in the days in St. Louis when we had a ecumenical discussion, and he was bemoaning the fact that the sisters, after communion, would go back to their pews and put their cowls over their head and not be a part of the whole. When our son Mark was a little babe in arms and we were at Valparaiso University and they had communion at this very huge cathedral-like church, 3 football lengths long, I think it was. When you would stand in line waiting to commune, I would point out and say, Mark, and there's Edie. Let's pray for her while we're waiting. Let's keep in mind these others who are coming. Let's pray for them. And even today at Trinity, when we couldn't meet together, and I would see people passing in front of us, I would be thankful for them and their witness. You know, sometimes some of them came with canes. One husband helping his wife who was really struggling to come, and I was seeing that as a witness and prayer for them, because while it's personal, it cannot be individualistic. It is communal, but nevertheless, it is also personal. So this powerful Jesus that we'll see in the next text when we look at Pilate and Jesus that John holds forth for the disciples is also very tender. Well, he weeps for his friend Lazarus, right? His friend Lazarus. And he has his friend who leaned upon his breast at the supper, right? And that's part of the witnessing. Right? So, yes, it is amazing that he does this. Well, let's take a look now at a very powerful image, but we'll also see there's a little clinker relationship to friend. Again, if you would just seek to be surrounded, let it flow over you, all of the senses that you have, and let them speak to you. Again, there's no answer that you can give that's wrong. So Jesus has been before the high priest and following his being taken into captivity. So now they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jewish leaders replied, "We're not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this was I born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?"
Actually, government dedicated to nothing but fighting the truth. We pay lawyers huge sums to find the truth. We're constantly looking for, the right and wrong, the truth. I myself find myself many times thinking, what is right, what is wrong, and debating between the two. That my thoughts and things over time change. I think that question is something we battle with constantly. But what about what Pilate was thinking when he said that? What was in his mind?
It's
Probably worried about a revolt, probably worried about his position and how he'd look to the Caesar. Truth to him probably was anything that would preserve his well-being.
yeah, it's not good to put yourself in Pilate's shoes. I think that deepens our perspective.
He had a lot of writing on this too. One thing he did, as I understand it, one thing he didn't want was not to be able to control his people. The death of one man probably didn't mean much to him.
Not to Pilate, no. I like what you said about earlier, Marilyn, about Jesus' calmness. I had not heard it quite that way, even though apparently I read it somewhat that way. It happens when you read things aloud. Jesus is clearly in charge here, isn't he? The leaders think they're in charge, or would like to be. And Pilate assumes he's in charge. Coming back to Dennis for a minute, you kind of think, well, maybe Pilate, what do I have to do with this guy? It's a nuisance. Though it's also true that there were some folks that caused a lot of trouble and got some little uprisings starting that claimed to be messiahs. So Pilate probably was aware of that kind of thing too. Still, Jesus didn't look like that kind of a flame-throwing rebel. Any other thoughts? What other things did you all sense?
I just feel, and Marilyn, you said calm. How in the world could you be calm in the middle of what is truth, who's the oppressor over the oppressed, and who's legal and who's illegal, and you're a criminal and you're not a criminal. I mean, just all these things coming in the midst of all of it. How do you even keep track of what's going on? That the question, Burton, of who's in charge. I mean, that's a good question. Lots of people thought they were or weren't, and the kind of back and forth of what's going on here is just almost too much to deal with. And yet, Marilyn, as you said, Jesus kind of knew who he was and knew what he was about in the midst of it all. I wouldn't have.
One thing, Jesus really wasn't trying to defend himself.
No.
You know, most people would be begging for mercy, maybe trying to give some reason, their standings on something, but I can't read where Jesus really said anything in his defense. Through the beatings, through the trip to the gallows, or the crucifixion.
One of the things that I felt more than usual, and perhaps it's because of contemporary situations these days, when we hear scripture, when we read scripture, we don't read it without thinking about our current context. We're influenced by it. And that's not bad. But This time, as I heard Jesus' response, you would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Right? And he says, well, are you a king? And he says, well, I'm not the kind of king you think I am. And if I were, my followers would fight. And of course, there is the instance of the putting away the sword and so forth that other parts of the story, both in the synoptics and in John, tell, right? And I think today about, sadly, some Christian communities believe that it's appropriate to take up arms, to defend the Christian way, or to defend even the Christian nation. Norma's going to be addressing that with the deaconess community shortly, right? About civil religion. You want to say, you see that appropriate to note here?
I'm actually with the Southeastern Iowa Synod. This whole question of American civil religion and Christian nationalism and all of this of thinking that are we God's special people, but I think, well, Jesus was clear, but indeed, so many people think, well, God calls us to take up arms to defend God, as though God needed defending, or even as if Christ needed defending. I mean, that would have happened here if that were the way it was going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that we just kind of do, as you say, kind of a suicide and just lie there and don't do anything. But to somehow think that God calls us to kill other people in the name of Jesus, that's not what Jesus did.
And he could have.
Yeah.
He could have called upon them. I don't think he would have called fire from heaven himself, but he could have called on his followers. They were extensive. One of the reasons that the Jewish leaders were concerned was because there were so many, there are several instances in which they don't do anything to him because of the followers, the crowds who are. So he could have. It was possible, and perhaps he might have even been tempted to do that. Certainly in the Gethsemane story, which isn't told in the same way in John, he didn't want to die, and he really struggled with that. Right?
There are some interpretations of Judas's behavior as being the reason that Jesus is betrayed by Judas. The reason Judas turns on him isn't necessarily because he doesn't believe that Jesus is the Christ, but because Jesus is not the kind of Christ that Judas had hoped for. What do you make of that? How do you interpret that, kind of along these lines?
Yeah, well, if we think back to that painting of the foot washing, where most of us think that Judas is way in the back when Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, and he's sort of standing off. This was not the kind of Christ, it wasn't what he signed up for.
Yeah.
So, he was deeply distressed and disappointed. And I see, even when Jesus notes in the foot washing story that not all of them will be following him. One will be lost, and I think he's very sad about that. It's an extreme depiction that he will be, in a sense, claimed by demonic force. But yes. So here is a time in which Jesus is standing before Pilate, and he's clearly in charge. Now, I did not mention, and I probably should, but partly I was trying to keep the reading short, but there is another section that comes. And Jesus, Pilate asks the crowds who are egged on by the Jewish leaders, do you want me to release Barabbas, this bandit, or do you want to release Jesus? And they cried, not this man, but Barabbas. And John noticed now, notes. Now, Jesus was a bandit. So Pilate takes Jesus and has him flogged, and they put the crown of thorns on him. And again, he brings him back, right? And brings him before the crowd. So I'll pick up chapter 19 if you want to follow it in your text, but also I'd ask you to listen to it at first. Jesus comes back and beginning in verse 5 of chapter 19. Oh, well, actually, verse 4. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing out him to you, to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." And when the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jewish leaders answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he is claimed to be the Son of God." Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and was about noon. He said to the Jewish leaders, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "So shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. I still can't hear that story without having a deep sense of sorrow. So what did you all sense? I'll give you a few moments to reflect.
I can't really put myself in that situation because we don't have an emperor and we're not part of a group that's oppressed by a Roman Empire. So it's a different situation for us. But I just see in all of this, and reading through my contemporary eyes, people of avoiding taking responsibility for, or saying, we found him guilty. You crucify him. No, I don't find him guilty. You crucify him. The whole being battered around, and that's the world ever since, in the world today, of hand him over, or hand him back, or this is my ruler. This isn't, either avoidance or demanding. And that's what human beings do and keep doing over and over again. And then Pilate saying, I mean, this whole interchange here, you do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said he's the King of the Jews. And then Pilate said, no, I'm going to write what I wrote. So I mean, he has a viewpoint in here, but the whole abandonment of Christ and being thrown back and forth is I can't imagine that. And yet how difficult the suffering. We think Christ suffering on the cross, but suffering in the midst of all of this. Wow.
It's kind of powerful. So yeah, any other reflections that you all have?
I think it's the silence of Jesus in this section of the story that always strikes me, and it did again this time. The narrative points it out toward the beginning, that Jesus gives him no answer, and that's the last time. No, Jesus does give one more answer after that, but there's just a lot of silence from here on out of Jesus having things done to him, and he doesn't speak anymore in the story. I think that jumped out, and there's a harshness to it, even down to I caught this time in verse 13, the stone pavement, place called the stone pavement, Gabbatha, and just how kind of cold and harsh that whole scene feels. And I'm imagining a terrace built out of white or gray stone, very, very kind of cold.
Saying they dudes, but I can guarantee you walked that one down there. And I try to imagine what it must have been like that day. That's at least the path that they say he walked is a narrow streetway. It's that big. The pain he had been flogged is going to his death. That'd be quite a thing for the people there who supported him, but was afraid to say anything, afraid to come to his aid.
Yeah,
at the cross.
Peter especially, right?
Yes. And they pointed out 3 locations where they thought the crucifixion took place. Any of us for sure. But the thoughts, the feelings, the anxieties, all went into that moment was something that worthwhile to think about.
So I think I heard you say also that was meaningful, but moving into it again more deeply, maybe with that in the background, gives you I don't want to put words in your mouth, but has given you another, I don't want to say shot, jarring.
Well, I think what you're doing here, what appeals to me is you're taking an in-depth look at something, a precise time, a precise moment. I think that's important to try to understand things. And there's a lot of things we don't understand. I don't understand. And it's fine to reason them and try to think about them. I mean, you just got to take by faith. But that'd be a terrible day.
Yeah.
And then when you think about the temple, the curtain was ripped in 2. Guys, I've heard that curtain was almost a foot or 2 foot thick. It wasn't a curtain like you have hanging over your living room window or something. So all those things transpiring that day, people suddenly deciding, well, maybe this guy was what he said he was.
Dennis, you're mentioning Sunday school. What I remember, or one thing I remember, is that we were to learn about the story, like learn who Herod is, who Pilate is, but that's just kind of learning about it instead of, as being immersed in it. The other thing that flashed in my mind is the Palestinians being trapped in Gaza and the children knowing there's no place, we can't get out. There's no way we're going to be bombed and we can't get out. There's no way to escape. and that somehow that feeling of being trapped, which I've never been in that sense, that, I mean, I guess that whole thing of feeling being trapped and entrapments and that's going on here.
We can go in many different directions. I thought you might mention something that we both were saddened by, that there was some point at which educators said we shouldn't tell children about the crucifixion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, there was actually, this was way back years ago, but we had a new Sunday school teacher among us who'd gone downtown or something and gotten some books, not through the church publishing houses, and it was about this, and they just left off the crucifixion entirely because it was supposed to be an Easter book, and I thought, no, okay, you can't leave out the crucifixion.
It's our son,
Fine.
our son Mark calling you, and normal. Have to tell him to call back. He tries to call at very good times. Yeah, I mean, they skipped, and I think that I remember one time, and for some reason there wasn't a noontime service or something, but I was in the mall in Dubuque on Good Friday, and what's happening at Good Friday was children are being lined up to get their picture taken with the Easter Bunny. Well, I think, and it's an innocent kind of thing, but people even speaking about that time as being Easter, which it isn't yet. I get a little extreme about that. I think we shouldn't call it Easter anymore, because we got to turn it over to the bunnies and to the eggs and call it the Festival of the Resurrection.
Interesting you mentioned that about crucifixion not being exposed to children, and I never thought about that. But as far back in Sunday school as I can remember, we talked to the crucifixion. And I never was, it was a part of our faith. It was a story. That's the reason celebrating Easter was part of it. So I can't say that I had any horrible feelings as I recall, because from the earliest age, I can remember the story.
It was the church when I was in Denver studying, it was a large church that for the Easter weekend had a big banner out front, free Easter egg hunt. And everybody welcome. I thought, no, that's not what it's about. But that's another kind of avoidance, isn't it? And people do not need to be shielded from this, because each of us has trapped, or each of us has betrayed somebody else, or each of us has turned somebody else in, or all of that thing of the human, what I call the human predicament, that we need to know about it, because that connects with our own betrayals and denials and beatings and so on, so that Easter really is good news of God's unconditional love. That's a lot better than a free Easter egg hunt.
I think of the hymn, if you don't bear the cross, then you can't bear the crown. I would think if you can't hear the cross, you can't see the crown. Might be. And by the way, when you were also talking about the words expressing, I was thinking of about Jesus not speaking much, and he never said a mumbling word. That great African American song, and he never said a mumbling word. Another thing I'd like to note here is that little word friend pops up.
The word what?
The word friend.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Because it gives a deeper meaning to when Jesus said, I have called you friends. Because when they said, if you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. There was a specialness to being a friend of the emperor, and you were even given a ring if you were the emperor's friend, if you were on the inside track, if you were special.
That's
And
fantastic. I've never heard that connection before. That is fantastic.
but I never made the connection before we studied it now.
Oh, wow.
It really spoke to me more than ever before. The disciples are Jesus' friends, friends of this one who is more powerful than Pilate.
Wow. I bet that's not an accident, is it? That's, wow. That's really.
And then it says, when Pilate heard these words, then he brings Jesus outside under that stone pavement you talked about and makes one more effort. You know, John doesn't have the story that's in one of the synoptics about Pilate's wife telling him about the dream. That's not here. But John is clearly contrasting Pilate to Jesus.
Yeah.
Here's all the power in Jerusalem, in Judea and Palestine, representing all of the power in the whole world. The power of Caesar, who is called Lord. And so friend gets, I think, much deeper meaning when we think back to where Jesus says this, which is following the vine and branches, right?
Yeah. It really is the same kind of movement where it's about Jesus making that happen too, right? I mean, here it's, you are no friend of the emperor because of the way you are presenting yourself, or the way you're answering these questions or whatever. But Jesus in John 15 says, you are my friends, as the one in power, right? Says, you are my friends. And how that flips it, you know, whereas Pilate's like, if you don't do it right, you're no friend of the emperor. Jesus flips it around and makes it a grace move, right? Makes it a gift. That's really, yeah, that's really good.
Because in Rome you had friends and then you had the others.
Yeah.
And the rest were all subjects.
Yeah.
Objects, really.
Yeah.
I don't know why we call people subject. I think they ought to be called objects because, you know, they're like non-entities, things to move around, right?
Yeah.
So here is it clear that Jesus and John is king and in charge, but a different kind of king, right? And think back to, if you were hearing this, if you were from a struggling time, and the power of the emperor has just kicked you out, forced you out, threw you out of Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple where many thought, including Christians, thought the Messiah was going to come. The temple's gone. No hope there anymore. And the power of the emperor is so powerful that he takes selected people, leaders, and takes them as booty to portray in the march back into Rome. Titus's arch pictures that, and including hauling the great candelabra, and some of the people. That's happening. They're hearing about that. And they're also people who call Jesus Lord. Now, I relate this to the passage in Corinthians where Paul says, no one can say Jesus be cursed by the Spirit, but you cannot say Jesus is Lord except by the Spirit. Now, if you paid $5 to a person down on his luck who's looking for his next drink, he probably could say Jesus is Lord. In those days, to say Jesus is Lord was a criminal confession. So think now again to what we looked about with Thomas, who Jesus said, don't be distrusting, but be trusting. And then Thomas bears witness. He says, my Lord and my God. Both of those things were kind of claimed by the emperor, and later it said that Domitian insists on it in writing. So John is saying, oh, here is your Lord and your God, and this one will be with you, even though you have all of that power pushing you out of your home. So I think it speaks powerfully. Any other comments on this? And then I have sort of an overarching comment. I like the way one of you said, going deeper into these, and we will go into an 8th one and a final one among our studies. But like John, who said, there are many other things that I could have chosen to write about. There are many other stories that we could have chosen. And I encourage you to look at many of the other stories. I deliberately did not choose the lessons that the Gospels for our Sundays, because you can hear about those in the preaching, and we've had some powerful preaching on those stories. Well unpacked, I think, especially of Pastor Dan's unpacking of the vine and branches and a place to be at home in, right? Be at home in Christ. But the sermons have been very rich in that way. There's so much more that we could be swimming around in this great gospel. We've also chosen not to go into detail about asking who John is. We could be doing that, but I would much prefer us to sort of just dive in and swim around in and let the scriptures delight us and be refreshed in them. So I'd encourage you, I think it was Sharon, and we miss her this evening, but I think it was Sharon who said that she's going to read through the whole gospel according to John now, and she's going to read it aloud. So I'm delighted if that happens. So I hope this is, in a sense, not quenched your thirst, but deepened your thirst as we go. Well, are there any other comments that you'd like to make? Thoughts, questions? If not, go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you.
We hope you have been refreshed as we've been swimming in the Gospel according to John, the story of Jesus before Pilate. This is one of 8 dives into the Gospel. They're available on Trinity Lutheran Church Mason City's YouTube site.